what the heck is the point of Barfly? Well, if you think Mickey Rourke is cool, or if you think Charles Bukowski is cool, then you may enjoy watching him stumble around for an hour and a half. You might think this movie is cool. To be fair, though, the way Mickey Rourke talks in the movie is cool. The way the bar is lit up in the movie, it's pretty cool. Who's going to argue about these things? Even the most staunch prohibitionist has to admit that this is an interesting production with an almost unparalleled street feel and a few moments. They're faint, but they're there. A few moments that are poignant and endearing. A lot of subtlety, a lot of thinking left to the audience in this movie. A film to savor in many ways. Barfly is from 1987. Yep, we're doing an American film from the 1980s on the channel. It doesn't really feel like a 1980s film. It's not obvious when the movie is set, even, although there are a few hints of 1980s fashion, if you can call it that. The movie was directed by Barbet Schroeder, who sounds like one of the Stepford wives, but he's actually a Swiss-Iranian director. I haven't seen any of his other movies, and to be honest, they look kind of bad. But if there's something I should be aware of, then let me know down there. Mickey Rourke plays Charles Bukowski. He plays a character based on Bukowski named Henry Chinaski. And the movie, it was written by Charles Bukowski. We'll talk about this in a little bit. Faye Dunaway is also in the movie, of course, because we're still doing the Faye Dunaway series. This is kind of one of her last significant roles. Don't forget about Arizona Dream, which is a pretty interesting film. I think she's really good in Barfly. Maybe the closest to being a real person, a normal person, that Faye Dunaway was in any of her movies, or ever. Theodora Van Runkle is nowhere to be found in this production. This is some of Dunaway's best acting. You can make a case for this being her finest acting. At times, the movie feels a little bit like a scenario created for an acting workshop, but still, she does a good job. Next week, I'm going to wrap up the Faye Dunaway series. I haven't decided what film to finish on yet. Do I dare watch Mommy Dearest? I'll present my grand unified theory of Faye Dunaway, whichever movie we end up on. For now, I'll just say that although this sort of feels like a big departure from Dunaway, mainly because it's not a glamorous role, and a lot of her roles are somewhat glamorous, I think there's still a lot that links Barfly to her other films and to her life. On the most basic level, Faye Dunaway was an alcoholic in real life, but hey, in Hollywood, who wasn't? Like I said, this is a movie about Charles Bukowski. These days, I think many people would have a vague idea who that is, but probably wouldn't have read his stuff, I guess. I don't know. He's not in the limelight as much as he once was. Bukowski was a writer, born in Germany, actually, but associated mainly with Los Angeles. He wrote poems, short stories, novels, movies, all kinds of stuff. He had a focus on the edges of society, the fringes of society. You might call him an underground figure, and he was an unrecognized figure for large parts of his career, but he did find the spotlight eventually and cachet within some less underground parts of society, such as people who make movies, although this isn't exactly a mainstream film. If you're looking for a video where a diehard Bukowski fan breaks down Barfly, you've come to the wrong place, because I haven't read much from him, maybe a couple random poems down the years. We're going to talk about the movie mainly. I will say that Bukowski is a compelling figure, and in some ways, that's what the movie is all based around. Barfly reminds me a little bit of other left-field literary adaptations, like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which I have a video about, or like Naked Lunch. These are movies about writers who had extreme lives, who did a lot of drugs. Bukowski, of course, mainly an alcoholic, but who did a lot of drugs, and had extreme sort of countercultural lives. These movies are sort of adaptations of books, like Naked Lunch. That's a book. I've read the book, in fact. And but they're kind of more focused on the authors themselves. They're sort of the work, but they're kind of biographical. Of course, a lot of these books were maybe autobiographical in the first place, so the lines are a little blurry, but these movies are often doing a couple of different things. Usually there's a bit of indirection. They're telling the story of the author. They're giving you background, but they're also kind of implying the work. Sometimes this is pretty explicit. Maybe we actually see a character sitting down at a typewriter and he starts clacking away, and we hear a snippet of what they're working on in voiceover or something like that. We get this in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. Some of the best scenes are when you just hear the words, right? We get it a couple of times in Barfly as well, but only brief snippets, not really enough to get a sense of Bukowski's writing. There are also more subtle ways in which movies look towards books. Of course, there's usually some kind of connection between the author and the work, so just learning about the author maybe lets you fill in something, although the audience might have to do a lot of the work themselves. the circumstances of the work, and the work usually are connected, and sometimes you can dwell on that. You can think about that. In this case, in Barfly, it kind of all feels like the same thing because the work is, again, fairly autobiographical, and because the tone and the sensibility of the author is one of the most important parts of the work. I almost feel like once you get the vibe of Bukowski, once you get sort of his ethic, that is a large part of his writing. But hey, I haven't read most of his writing, so I could be wrong. The movie, I think, captures this, but again, not really sure. Having said all this, I like all three of these movies that I mentioned. I think they're great, but I also think they kind of all fail. Or at least I wasn't convinced by any of them as literary adaptations. Maybe Barfly isn't supposed to be a literary adaptation, but I still wish the balance between the backstory and the creative output was a little bit different. It feels like we're trying to do two different things. Maybe it doesn't quite turn out as well as it could. I also have to admit that I don't find any of these movies to be compelling portraits of intellectuals. When I see how these authors lived, I don't think, wow, they must have written some great stuff. There's romanticism at play here, which is kind of ironic because all these guys were pretty cynical, but there's romanticism of these delirious and deviant, I guess, lifestyles. I find that a bit hard to reconcile with their intellectual output, but that might just be a me problem to some extent. Okay. Anyway, there is a movie that I think absolutely nails the balance between biography and adaptation, and that tells the story of an author and implies her output really well. That's the movie An Angel at My Table, directed by Jane Campion, about the author Janet Frame. I have a video about it, and that movie profoundly captures her work, but also tells a really compelling story about her process of becoming, about her intellectual journey, about all the sacrifices to be a writer and an artist. What sacrifices are there in these movies that we're talking about here? I mean, that's sort of telling in some ways. It doesn't feel like Hunter S. Thompson was sacrificing a lot. Well, I don't know. In some ways, divisive figures, and in some ways, this exploration of these sort of writers who led extreme lives is kind of the point, right? And not even the point of the movie, but in some ways, the point of the original work, an experiment with the other edge of society is in some ways what all these people were doing. So maybe it's a little bit naive to say, oh, well, but they weren't in the library 24/7. I can't read this. I don't know. It's interesting. Like I said, I remain kind of unconvinced by all those movies as literary adaptations, but they're cool nonetheless. Getting back to Barfly, this movie is ostensibly a comedy. I didn't find it to be particularly funny. Henry definitely has some zing to him. It's a little on the cynical side, but he's got some good lines. And there are a few moments that are more like traditional jokes, like when the paramedics show up and then they show up again. These are almost a little too cartoonish to be in the movie, but it works out. The film sort of works by seeing just how outrageous Henry is going to be. Oh, what's he going to do next? Although compared to the other movies we just talked about, his antics aren't actually that wild. And in some ways, he's a pretty understated character. There's an interesting scene in the movie where Henry is talking about Eddie. Eddie is a bartender and Henry's arch enemy. Henry says that Eddie is everything he hates. He's obvious and he's macho. This is a big moment. Now, I think it's a little too on the nose. Ironically, this moment is a little too obvious. It's actually one of the weakest lines in the whole movie, I think, but it reads almost as a manifesto. It creates some distinctions, which are important, though. Henry has spent most of the movie fighting and drinking, but he says that this person who is his antithesis is macho. So he doesn't see himself as being macho, and he doesn't see himself as being obvious. So he's got some other path he's on. He's doing some other kind of work. That's interesting. It's telling to see just how allergic to obviousness Henry is. Allergic to obviousness. It's not like he just dislikes it. It's like he's running away from it at full speed. Sometimes I watch interviews with bands that I really like, and we're talking about bands that make weird music that, normal people do not listen to. And the interviewer will ask the band, hey, what's your favorite movie? And then they'll list out a bunch of, not very cool stuff, right? A bunch of mainstream, sort of predictable things. Some people can have very evolved tastes in some fields, but not in others, I guess. I don't know. I also have friends, though, that don't watch movies at all, but I know if I take them to some weird, inaccessible movie, they're going to like it because they just have a certain sensibility in all the things that they consume and are interested in. Interesting sidebar there. Henry, and by extension Bukowski, seems like he would definitely be in the second category, defines himself by running away from anything that's not cool. Is cool the right word? Is this a movie about coolness? Question for the floor. It definitely comes up, I would say. this running away from the uncool might be a hint as to why the movie is the way it is. It might be a hint as to why the movie leaves a little bit on the table. Bukowski wrote the movie, after all, and he seems to go to great distances to avoid anything too predictable or uncool. And yeah, we end up with a movie that's maybe a little too understated and devoid of story and could actually use possibly a little bit more Hollywood artifice, maybe. On the other hand, maybe the movie could only exist exactly as it is, or maybe it could only be a true reflection of him exactly as it is. I like the movie. I think it more or less works, but, I do wonder. It has great characters, it has great vibes, great settings, but is it a great movie? Maybe not quite. It's great for what it is, perhaps. I think, really, Barfly is a short story more than anything. Okay, at first you might think of Henry as a bum, someone with no real agenda, but you'll come to see that he's got a pretty firm course plotted. Well, maybe not a course, but he's got a strong value system. Maybe it only has a few values, and they're not going to be your values, most likely, but he has them, and he cares about them, and he has some kind of dignity in them as well. Maybe this is true of a lot of people on the fringes of society. Maybe it's just the ones who are writers. This movie is reaching a little bit towards a social comment, but maybe it's slightly too understated to make it, I guess. That's probably not the point of the movie. We have a wealthier character here as well, standing in for the cultural elite, and there's some juice to this subplot. It's interesting to see the worlds together. Both of these characters are pretty sure they can understand each other, and this is where the romanticism angle kind of reaches its peak and is a little bit hard to believe, I guess. Romanticism is a key word for the movie, though. You might say, well, it's romanticizing drunkenness, and maybe that's a bit naive, hard to get on board with that. But another way to look at it is to see that deep down, maybe what drives Henry is some kind of search for freedom, some escape from a gloomy blue-collar world. He's choosing something else and chasing something else, and that is inherently a romantic idea. I mean, trying to escape from the drudgery of society and do something interesting, if you're not romantic about that, you will fail. Like, that is inherently a search for something interesting and out there, right? Romanticism, key question of the movie. And again, it goes to this idea of these writers living sort of subversive lifestyles, subversive but also maybe questionable lifestyles, experimenting with the other side, right? And I think a lot of these movies a little ambivalent about whether or not that is a good idea, I guess, even when they're written by Bukowski or involve these authors themselves, I guess. We'll see. There's another significant moment in the film when Dunaway describes Henry almost as a sort of aristocrat. And it's an incisive comment because he does kind of look like royalty. He sort of has a swagger to him, even maybe a high-mindedness. That's a little bit surprising. It's a great line. It's a great line. Remember, of course, Bukowski wrote this about himself, which is a little bit interesting, and maybe that rubs you the wrong way, but I think it points to a fairly important structure in the movie. Okay, when Barfly starts, if you didn't know that Bukowski or that Henry was a writer, you would never guess it from the movie, from what he's doing. He seems just totally lost. Slowly, though, you enter his world, and I think this is, in some ways, the principal mechanic of the film. This is what structures it all. At one point, kind of early on, someone offers him money, and Henry says, "Nah, what do you think I am, some kind of bum?" Most people would say, yeah, and in some ways, it seems like he's playing that as a joke, but maybe not. It turns out that not only is he not a bum, but he's a king. He's royalty in his own way, right? I want to talk a little bit about the ending of the film, because I think it concludes this nicely. So minor spoilers incoming, although the ending, in some ways, nothing happens, so it's not really a spoiler. The ending, I think, in some ways, is a total letdown, to be honest, and it symbolizes what might at first seem like just aimlessness in the movie. Just when you think something might happen, when things are looking up, we literally go right back to the beginning, right? Okay. But if you buy into this feeling of coming into Henry's world as that being sort of the principal idea of the film, or at least a significant one, then I think the beginning and the end are actually totally different. In the beginning, you think, what's this guy doing? At the end, you think, oh, he's having some fun. Something like that. And of course, the patrons of the bar are more on his side, which is kind of signposts to this idea of like people coming around to this lifestyle. The movie really dodges any traditional character arc. Would you say that Henry has changed anything or has learned anything or changed? No, the opposite. It's more like we have learned to have some faith in him. He just continues to be himself without yielding, and then the audience comes around to it. So really, it's the audience that has to do the character development while watching this movie. I'm not sure that this is totally noticeable while you watch the film. Maybe I just made it up. But the film is dynamic in a subtle way, and this is something that I suspect comes from the literary world, and it works okay in a movie, but you got to know a little bit what to expect. The movie might feel like less than what you want, I guess. Anyways, you can tell I'm a little bit split on the movie. I like the movie in general. I think it's got a great look and feel, nice lighting, especially in the bar, great locations again. The bar, really captivating, real place, it would seem. Good sound design, and the movie undeniably has a vibe. Bukowski's world is kind of alluring. Maybe he is a somewhat divisive figure, maybe a little bit too cynical. I don't know, up to you to decide that, but there is definitely some kind of allure to it. On the other hand, maybe it feels a little bit like an acting exercise. Bukowski was possibly too cool to put a plot in the movie. Maybe the whole concept of bringing you into his world is fundamentally self-centered. I don't know. If you don't like the guy, you probably won't like the movie. As gritty as the film is, I think Barfly is really one to savor. As over the top as it sometimes is, it's a movie with a lot of subtlety. And yeah, I don't think that necessarily they got to add a whole bunch of action. Well, it kind of has action, or that they got to add a whole bunch of obviousness to it or anything like that, because sort of the point is for you to do some of the thinking. It's a bit slow, but it has dynamics. I think for what it is, this is a great movie, but the scope maybe is a little bit limited. Would I recommend it to everyone? I think everybody can get on board with the characters and the vibe, but I think the average viewer might wonder, wait a second, isn't there going to be a story or something like that? But nonetheless, I think Barfly is a cool movie, and like I said, one to savor.